Bonjour à tous, bon après-midi. Re-bienvenue dans le studio principal, le studio 2. J'espère que vous allez bien, que vous avez profité de votre pause du midi pour manger, échanger, réseauter. Nous sommes à MTL Connect, journée 1. MTL Connect, la semaine numérique de Montréal. Oui, c'est une très belle initiative. Je vous invite aussi, si ça vous tente, pourquoi pas, essayons de remplir le centre de la salle. J'aime ça, belle initiative. Tant qu'à s'éparpiller, si ça vous plaît, à votre guise, on vous invite à vous rassembler. Comme ça nous donne une ambiance un peu plus chaleureuse. Bonjour, monsieur. Vous allez bien? J'aime beaucoup votre moustache. Oui, ça va très bien. Merci. Très pointu. J'aime ça. Mon nom est Armaf Camille, votre animateur depuis le début d'MTL Connect. Je vais être avec vous jusqu'à la fin de la Semaine numérique de Montréal. Alors, c'est un plaisir d'être ici avec vous. Nous partons notre segment d'après-midi où on va toucher sur la culture et la créativité. My name is Armaf Camille. I'm your MC. I've been your MC from the beginning of the week, and I'll be here till the end of the week. And it's a pleasure to be here. We're touching on culture and creativity. This is our block for the afternoon in the Studio 2. Nous sommes dans les bureaux de 7 doigts de la main. Vraiment des très beaux bureaux, une très belle salle. Nous sommes contents qu'ils nous ont accueillis de la part du Printemps numérique, de nos partenaires, gouvernement du Québec, Ville de Montréal, MTL Connect. On vous remercie. Et merci à vous tous d'être ici et les internautes qui nous regardent à la maison. Merci. So our next topic is Decolonizing Place, Reinstating Indigenous Ecosystems and Sovereignty. Restaurer les écosystèmes et la souveraineté autochtone. Notre conférencière, our head speaker, our keynote speaker is Cheryl Bryce. She's a Songhees Nation member who practices growing and harvesting traditional foods and sovereignty in the same way her ancestors did before her. Et pour modérer la conversation, to moderate the conversation, we have Pamela Tudge, standing right next to the stage, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Concordia, and she actually has known Cheryl for over 20 years. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Pamela Tudge.
Okay, so I'm excited and I'm privileged to be introducing Cheryl today. She's joining us from southern Vancouver Island, Lekwungen territory. And to start off the session today, I would like to begin our session by acknowledging that our conference, Montreal Connect today, is located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Kahnawake Nation, terrible pronunciation, sorry. The Kahnawake Nation is recognized as custodians of the lands and our waters as we gather today. Montreal, what was known today as Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many different First Nations, and today it's home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other people within the Montreal community. Cheryl, currently at home in Lekwungen territory, will be delivering the talk. And we will be taking questions at the end as well. So if you have any questions, you can think about them. We'll be having them on the mics. I want to note too, I've known Cheryl for 20 years. Her work is very important to me in many ways, especially as a food researcher. And Cheryl is phenomena at her own artwork that she's done over the years, collaborating with artists. She's given numerous public talks, and she's participated in documentaries and worked with various media outlets in Canada to share her cultural practices and knowledge. So without further ado, she's with us today. Cheryl? Let's see.
I'm sorry I'm not there in person. I became ill, and so hopefully I'm clear and you can hear what I'm saying. But I'm sorry I wasn't in person. I wish I could be there. All right, I'll continue through. I'm not sure if you can see my PowerPoint, but just to recap what we said, my name is Cheryl Bryce. I'm a member of the Lekwungen people, and that's our traditional name. The colonial name is Songhees, so many might know us as the Songhees Nation. I'm a traditional knowledge holder. I have various things I've done, like Pam has said. But I'm going to talk a little bit more today about decolonizing place as it relates to land. And I often find in conversations when I talk about land, it's easier to have that conversation. It's a good visual because it's decolonizing the land as well. And it's a good way to kind of see it and experience it and learn about what colonialism is and how to decolonize and how to start decolonizing. That's really up to individuals and how you do that. But this is what this conversation is about. So the picture that I had prior was a photo of one of the pit clips I did, which I'll get into a bit later. But today I'm going to speak mainly to, or just give you an overview of some of the things I'm going to talk about and do an acknowledgement, the historical colonial actions, like just sort of examples of Lekwungen ancestral lands, Kwetlal Food Systems, colonial impacts, and how to work together, and talk about decolonizing place and what that means, and just answering some questions. And so just to recap what Pam said, I'd just like to acknowledge where you are today on the unceded territories of the Ganawage, the traditional custodians of the lands and waters on which the MTL Connection conference is taking place and where you're participating in person. Virtually, I'm anchoring you into my traditional homelands known as Lekwungen ancestral lands, otherwise known through the Indian Act as the Songhees Nation, and I'm calling in from my community. So thank you everyone for taking the time to be here, whether it's virtually or in person. And again, I'm sorry, I wish I was there to be with you in person. We're still in the pandemic, I guess, so I apologize, I'm not feeling well today. I thought I would start off with a bit of examples of, sorry, I'm clicking the wrong screen, so I'm sorry if I'm a little behind on my PowerPoint. But here are some examples of historical colonial actions. These are just to give you a glimpse, and it's kind of a bit of a segue into what I'm talking about. So just keep this in mind. There's so much more before 76 and in between each of these decades and years and up until now. So this is just capturing a few. So in 1776 to the 1780s, there was a smallpox epidemic. And that, and I'm speaking, that was everywhere, but especially here on the coast, it was hitting in what you know now as BC. In 1792, Captain Vancouver, or George Vancouver, came through and was sort of charting out what you now know as Vancouver Island, which is here along in BC and on the Western Canada coast. And he was charting it out and really just ignoring my ancestors and the Indigenous people along the coast, and just assigning colonial names to different geographic features. In 1830, Hudson Bay begins to inoculate some of the Indigenous people in different parts of what you know as Canada, but I'm speaking more specifically in BC. And Fort Victoria was built in around 1843 to 1844. It was fully going, and that was at the time when the Hudson Bay Company relocated some of my ancestors that were staying our ancestral lands, and relocated them across the harbor. And then 1850 to 1854, James Douglas pursued getting 14 Douglas treaties in BC, and Songhees has 14 of those. So kind of going into the next slide here, kind of gives you an idea for those who haven't been out in the Victoria area. We're on the south of Vancouver Island, on the far west of what you now know as Canada. And this gives you an idea, the map on the left shows you our traditional family names. So Lekwungen's traditional form of governance is by family groups, and we have 7 major family groups. And you can see all the different family groups: Decolonizing, Chillikwich, Slimuang, Kwasamson, Waimol, Kishmitsa, Kakyakin. Those are our major family groups, and within them, of course, there's lots of other families. And you can kind of look at the map to the right, and that's what you see as Victoria today, with all of its urbanization, with all the cities and all the municipalities, and this is still part of our ancestral lands. And of course, our ancestral lands include the land, the water, and going down into what's now known as the U.S. So the U.S. border did impact our traditional homelands. So this is something to keep in mind. And you can see to the far right, um, above the word Kosamson, it has a circle. That's actually where I am right now. That is Songhees Reserve. So it's new Songhees Reserve 1A is the Indian Act name. We have 4 reserves, and that's one of them, and that's the one that a majority of our members live on. Probably about half our population lives on this in this community. The other circle to the far right is 2 of our reserve islands, and then there's a small circle in the middle where the Victoria is listed on the map, and that's another reserve. So if you look at that large map of our ancestral lands, all those family groups, that is our ancestral lands. That is lands that we harvest our foods from. That's where we lived. That's where our ancestors lived. That's the traditional resources for our food. And now you can see the smaller area that our community resides and the impacts to a lot of our traditional food systems. We're lucky here on the coast. Our ancestors had a few different food systems, or you might refer to as an ecosystem. That is the Kwetlal Food System, or you might know as a Garryoke ecosystem. We have the fir forest, and we have, of course, waterways and the marine ecosystem. So abundance of food. And of course, I'm going to get into a bit more of our the impacts to our traditional foods. But I'm going to focus a little bit more on the systems. Otherwise, I could probably be here for a long time if I went into a lot of them, a lot of our traditional foods. So Kwetlal Food System, as I mentioned, many might know that as the Garryoke ecosystem, and this is a very important food system to Lekwungen, to our ancestors, and to who we are today, and for our future generation. Kwetlal is camas in English. Many might know as camas, and it's a traditional food and a highly sought after trade resource as well. So it was traded up and down the west coast and even inland to BC. And we traded further up north for Ooligan and into the interior along the Fraser for sturgeon. Even though there was camas going down into Washington, sometimes it was traded for razor clams. There were usually food resources we didn't have here or didn't have an abundance of, or other resources as well. This is a collage of photos, and it's just a collage of photos over time. I've been doing public pit cooks for well over 20 years, probably over 22, 30, 23 years publicly. Before then, a lot of the traditional harvesting and cooking was done just amongst my family. And I like to acknowledge that a good majority of all my knowledge is from my grandma, late Edna George. And we would go out harvesting a lot of our foods on the land throughout our traditional territory. And whether it was food or medicines, and sometimes we had to go further up into our family ties up island and harvest various other foods because it just wasn't safe. For example, a lot of our marine ecosystems was never safe to harvest shellfish here. So this photo kind of shows a lot of the different pit cooks throughout the decades, really. And just to give you an idea, to me, when I talk about food systems, to me, it's everything. It is the people, it's the land, it's the food, it's the environment, it's everything that connects together. It's the taking care of the land, it's harvesting, it's pit cooking, it's trading, it's celebrating food. And that's all what Kwetlal Food System means to me. And traditionally, Kwetlal Food Systems in Lekwungen were a large part of what you now know as Victoria or Greater Victoria. And it's really is a living artifact to my ancestors because the way they managed our food system and sustained it through the generations, that it's here today. Otherwise, it would have been, the firs would have taken over, a lot of the native shrubs would have moved in over time and taken over. So it was through the ongoing connection and management of our food systems that it is here today, and in a large part due to the Lekwungen women who manage these food systems. In particular, specific families would manage them and take care of them throughout the year. So preparing the fields in the spring, harvesting in the fall, doing traditional burns to kind of clear the land and push the firs back, push the shrubs back, and open up the ground floor for a lot of the camas and other foods that grow with the Kwetlal food system. Kwetlal is very unique. It's one of the few places in Canada you're going to find it. And the way that my ancestors took care of it was so abundant here in our Lekwungen ancestral lands that we were known as the people to go and trade for it. It was so abundant, and the way it was taken care of, it was highly sought after up and down the coast here. And we would trade in all different locations. It's all the people and it's all the celebrations that we've had over the time, which are very meaningful and are part of why I'm speaking in public. I started speaking more public and doing more public pitcbooks to create that awareness of we're still here. It's still important to us. It's still part of our diet. And talking about some of those challenges that we have in taking care of these traditional food systems. In this photo, you'll see some of the pit cooks that I've done. Some of them have been on our islands, our reserve islands that I mentioned, in our community, in all over my ancestral lands, whether they're in schools or up at the university, in parks. They're all in different areas. I've got communities that have camas also in their traditional territories, and teaching about camas and teaching pit cooks within their community. So I've traveled to do some of these picnics and to teach other communities and nations in their territories. And just one of the photos that I really love, well, many of these, is a lot of this is my family that is in these photos. To the top left is Catherine, and she's out helping me kind of take inventory of some of the plants. Little Josh is to the right. He's identifying camas at a very young age. He's not even quite 2. And there's some various photos in here of me just during different times of doing harvesting. I love this photo with the kids all with their hands into the earth and pulling it back, and they're harvesting camas in our traditional territory. So this was youth from Songhees and surrounding communities that all came to participate in the pit cook. It's about singing and celebrating camas as well. So there's some little Kieran's on the bottom left, and he's singing, and he always loved to sing, and so did Ethan in the center. Just loved to sing for the camas and celebrate the camas as we're harvesting, as well as doing other things like in removing invasive plant species and reinstating the Indigenous foods. And then the photo towards the center with a large amount of people eating, that's in our longhouse. And that was in 2001, and that was at a time when I thought, I'm doing these pit cooks all over in my ancestral lands and kind of keeping it to family in the most part, and decided to do more of a public one. And in this particular time in 2001, I did a huge pit cook by our longhouse and asked people that I knew that were fisher persons and hunters to come in and bring traditional foods. And we had a huge feast to celebrate foods. And it was one of the things that our ancestors did and that we continue to do. I mean, it's a part of all of our everyday life. It's a part of various events and celebrations, of course. But we also celebrate food, and camas was one of the foods we celebrated because it's our Indian gold, I guess you could say. It's a huge trade item. It's a very important food. It has inulin in it, so that when you cook it, it breaks down. It gets sweeter, much like an onion does. It gets more caramelized. So this celebration was huge. I thought it was going to be a few, maybe 25 people, but we filled the longhouse. And we had people on both sides of our longhouse in the kitchen as well as in the cultural area and outside. And we had lots of people who came together and brought songs and shared stories and talked about history. And it was in a whole different way of engaging within our community and with our family and our guests that came to take part. So it was a nice, huge celebration of Kwetlal. And to the right, at the bottom, you'll see Kwetlal cooked, and right beside it is uncooked camas. It's usually kind of has an outer color like kind of like an onion yellow, and you kind of peel it back and it goes white. But as it's cooked in the pit for about 24 hours to 48 hours, depending how dark you want the camas to go. When it gets this kind of golden color, it's nice and sweet, but you can also take it out and cook it with other foods. And I've also made it into fruit roll-ups, and that was one of our ways traditionally is, I guess you can say, our ingenuity kind of brought fruit roll-ups to the world. It was made with camas. It was mashed and mixed with a lot of our indigenous berries, so the native blackberry, the black caps, all the different kinds of berries that we have here, and it was mixed and flattened and dried, and it's really delicious. I can't explain what camas tastes like, but it tastes like camas. But if I was going to compare it to something, maybe like a tiny bit like a parsnip, depending how far you cooked it, and it has that consistency of a sweet potato. And again, it depends on how long you cook it. But if you cook it till it's blackened, then it kind of gets that consistency of a licorice, and it's much sweeter. So to the far right, you can see some of the food that I'm preparing for the pit cook, and this is one of our communities. And then towards the center, it's us pulling out the food. So it's absolutely amazing, and it's just amazing to be able to share it with my community and with my family, and to celebrate Kwetlal. And when I go out publicly to do the pit cooks, and I've been doing this for quite some time, it's so people can experience it in a way that they haven't before. Not to teach people how to go out and do it on their own, not to teach anyone that, to go and harvest Kwetlal or harvest camas or harvest any of the other foods within our Kwetlal food system. Or it's not to teach people how to do a pit cook. It's to teach people how important it is to us, and that they're participating so they can learn about Indigenous foods and why it's so important to who we are today, and why we need to work together to further protect what's remaining and reinstate Indigenous foods into our ancestral homelands. So to me, it's a living land, it's a living culture, it's a living artifact, it's a living history, and it's connecting generations. It's connecting our ancestors, it's connecting now, and it's connecting for our 7 generations ahead. Because I would hate to be an elder and be explaining to my family and to the youth in the community what camas used to taste like. So some of the things that I've been doing, like I mentioned, camas has always been there. We've always been harvesting. To some in our community, they may not have had it. There's not very much left. When you look at where camas grows with what's now known as Canada, it's really on the South Vancouver Island. And there's just maybe the odd spot in like the mainland, and they're just tiny little spots, but the majority is on Vancouver Island, with a lot of it being in our ancestral lands, Lekwungen ancestral lands. And of course, as you've seen on the map earlier in the slide, how it's been impacted by development has hugely impacted our Indigenous food systems, especially the Kwetlal food systems. And things that I've been doing over the years to reinstate these Indigenous food systems and to create that awareness is, of course, doing public pit cooks, to be able to have that experience where people are eating the food. And sometimes those pit cooks do not have camas. They're all colonial vegetables, simply to demonstrate the idea that this is how precious camas is and how few is left. And but that is the experience of taking part in that pit cook, eating the food while we're talking about traditional foods is so important, because you're taking all that experience in, and you're going to remember it a lot longer and a lot differently than have we just sat down to have a conversation. So a lot of work that has been going on is definitely my family, getting the family out on the ground, getting the youth out onto the ground, talking about the history, talking about Kwetlal foods, removing invasive species, reinstating Indigenous plants into our homelands, into our communities, and into our backyards, gathering seeds. As you can see here, some of the youth are gathering seeds, and that's camas seeds. So camas will grow from seed, but from seed it will take anywhere from 5 to 7 years for it to flower. So when they go from seed, not all of them are going to take, it takes a little bit. Once they do become like a little tiny pearl of a camas, then they start to kind of go tubular, and they start wiggling their way down into the earth a bit more until they keep going and going until they find their spot and they just fall out. And so they are just absolutely amazing. So they can propagate both by bulb and by seed. In the center, some other things that I've done is, of course, taking our youth and community members, family, guests, out onto the land and talking about the history. I call them colonial reality tours, so walking out onto the land and talking about the history, and then talking about those impacts of colonialism as they see it in front of them and historically as well. And taking the youth out and talking about our Indigenous history, plants and food systems, and identifying plants, identifying invasives, identifying non-native plants are part of it. So the youth here, I just created like it's like a scavenger hunt, but also a bingo game. So it was just taking the kids out and talking about plants and showing how to identify them and walking them out onto our ancestral lands and just as I'm talking, they're answering the questions right on the bingo game. And of course, there was prizes. Many other things, of course, like I said, the public picnics. The other things too is honoring our Indigenous lands. You know, like it's no disrespect in any way to Remembrance Day because I have family who have fought and are veterans, and it was a way to honor the issues that we're still dealing with now is by creating the camas flower and wearing at the same time as the poppy. So in the flower you see honoring Indigenous lands, you see camas flowers all over the wreath, and also would do them and hand them out as a way to honor the Indigenous people who have fought for their ancestral lands and continue to fight for their ancestral lands. So doing that is something that I'll do as to a way to remind people of the land and the issues that they're on right now, and the ongoing struggles and issues relating to land and sovereignty. Of course, working with other nations. One of the photos up to the top or to the far right in the center is just coming together with a lot of different nations and working with nations, sharing our capacity, sharing our resources in one way or another, whether it's through our knowledge or teaching or learning from one another and celebrating together. So many times I've worked with other nations, and this particular one is with Sartlet and Cowichan, and it's on our ancestral lands, and I'm walking them out and talking about some of the work that I've done on the land in that particular location, which is known as Ubit. And then I continue to work with municipalities and parks and reinstating Indigenous food plants and removing invasive species. It's a lot of work, and it's going to take a lot. It's going to be an ongoing, multi-generational work. It's just going to be, it's been something I've been doing for decades, and I know it's a long way ahead too. And I'll get a bit more into the impacts. But reinstating is a part of our cultural role. It's part of who we are as Lekwungen, and we have a very important role in protecting and reinstating our Indigenous food systems, including the Kwetlal Food System, or as known as the burial ecosystem by many. So what are some of those impacts? So colonial impacts are not just historic, and they're ongoing, and it's harm that continues on the land and with Indigenous people, to our culture, to our food systems. It's in everywhere we go, every institution, everywhere we go, it's going to be there. So it is colonial oppression of laws. It's the colonial oppressive laws. It's the human harm, it's the land and cultural harm, it's exploiting land and resources, systemic racism, and tokenism. And by tokenism, I mean like the acknowledgement we did today is wonderful, but it's really empty if it's all that anyone's willing to do or commit to doing. There's so much more of a commitment that needs to be done as it relates to decolonizing land, decolonizing systems. There's so much more that needs to be done, and acknowledgement is important, yes, but it doesn't excuse any of the colonial actions that continue to cause harm to land and to the Indigenous people. So as you look at some of these photos up at the top left There are drawings and paintings that were done like between 1846 to 47 by Paul Kane. And you remember when I was mentioning earlier when the Hudson Bay, like around 1844, when some of the members were moved from where the fort was across the harbor, he's capturing that in his painting and drawings. There is some happy accidents in this drawing. It's not 100% accurate, but what I love about the drawings is that it's through art, it's recording history. And, you know, like, for example, the canoe is not Lekwungen canoe, it's not a sailor's canoe. There's a few things in there that artists is taking liberation with, but I like how it captures the land and what it looked like back then in 1846. And you can see in the photo, or, up to the on the left, where the canoe's coming in the harbor, that is now known as Victoria Harbor. And to the far back, you can see a very faintly some structures, and that's where the fort is. And then the one in the center is where the members are relocated. So those are some of our canoes. For those that might know Victoria, this would be the area known as Vic West. And then to the top right, you're kind of getting a kind of a fuller view of it. And that's a little later. That's in the early 1900s. That's when the bridge was created. So that was the bridge known as Johnson Street Bridge today, but it connected the first, what became the first reserve for my ancestors. So where the ancestors were moved in 1844 across the harbor ended up becoming the first Indian Act Reserve. So that became the Songhees Reserve. And so those are huge, of course, big part of the colonial laws that really impacted my ancestors and who we are today, and the land, and of course our cultural ways and traditions have been, and foods have been impacted. This was the reserve for my ancestors until 1911, and my ancestors were relocated to where I am at this moment. At that time, because of the colonizers across the harbor felt that my ancestors were an eyesore and wanted to relocate them, and they wanted that land. And they had put in agreements with my ancestors at that time, and they said it was for housing, but they ended up using it for industrial purposes. Yeah, one of my ancestors, Kwetlal, and his father, Kwetlal, was one of the Douglas Treaty signatories that I mentioned earlier. So those family groups that I mentioned, the 7 major family groups, each one of them has a Douglas Treaty. So that's 7 here out of the 14 in BC. And Kwetlal wanted to move most of the people out to what is now known as Duvic in the Zero Park area. Back then, when that conversation, I call it a conversation, that was happening to relocate my ancestors. In the end, we didn't end up going to that area, which was part of my family ties. So the family ties with a different parts of the family group, but in particular the Canadian family group, which is now known in the land as today by many as Oak Bay and St. And so that's the old reserve in Europe, my ancestors were relocated in 1911. Other impacts, of course, are my ancestors didn't have to deal with invasive species, and now there's a huge amount of invasive plant species, non-native and invasive. And on the bottom left, it's got spring, of course, there's gorse, and there's ivy, and there's Himalayan blackberry. And there's a lot of other non-native plants that are occupying Kwetlal Food Systems and taking out a lot of the Kwetlal, suffocating out the dairy oak trees and taking out the chocolate lilies, the all of the different important plants within the Kwetlal Food Systems, and creating great harm to the home for many other different species of insects and animals and birds. It's home to many. I call it a family, but many might call it a community, as a plant community, but it's home to many. And we find ways to continue to connect with those memories. But we also see this as part of our family. So that's why I call it family. I'm going to get into some of those stories later. Of course, development and urbanization is a huge impact to our homeland, our ancestral lands, and our traditional food systems. It's a huge impact. It's like the concrete waste is huge. You know, we've got so many other things that we're trying to ensure don't impact our food systems. And there's so many different parts of it that are, and that's the colonial laws, of course, invasive species, environmental issues, and all of the use and development of our lands, and the disruptions of lands, and disruptions of important and sacred sites. So you see these pictures here, and down on the bottom, in the center, they're actually going in and excavating out a full wetland to develop in this area. The picture beside it was a very important, significant site that they went and just demolished. And these were actually, this is one of the sites that I protested in 2006 because the amount of damage that they were doing to our ancestors, because our ancestors were buried in that area, to our food systems, to our ancestral lands, and to sacred sites. And this one on the far right is an area where, sorry, I'm still not well, but I'm terrified. My voice is kind of going low. I hope we can keep doing. The one to the far right is another part where it was huge. It's important spring. Culturally, this is very important. Environmentally, it's important. And there's so many other significance to this particular area. And it was a natural spring. And it was heavily treated by the development that was happening above. And there was other species in there that were endangered, and some, red listed, and in and around that whole area. But this particular spot where this natural spring is, there was frogs literally like crawling out and dying while they're crawling out of this pond. So the impacts are historical, but they are now. There's definitely been impacts, and I walk out onto the land with my grandma, and she would teach me about the plants, and teach me about the history, and teach me about the family and the connections up and down the coast. I can only imagine what it must have felt for her to see all of this land, where she would go and harvest a lot of traditional foods, meet with family, have celebrations, gather for different events, just gone. Places that would be traveled from camps or temporary sites where they got to different locations to harvest, to meet with family, are gone. Not gone in the sense that it's no longer there to connect with. It's just as it's been cleared out and been developed over. It's still considered our ancestral lands. So I can imagine that. And as I've seen this happening before me and during my time, I was devastated. And I would be taking the youth out and the family out, and we'd be talking about the history. Even the children were walking around and saying, what is going on? This is where we do, I can't go into it, but specific cultural practices. This is where we harvest specific food. And they would go on about it, going, what are we going to do? Like, this is where we go. What are we going to do now? We're already having to go further and further out of, up island, further out to find different locations to do particular ceremonies, to do particular practices, to do particular harvesting. What are we going to do? And this is coming from children, and they were like getting really very concerned and wondering, what are we going to do about this? And so I said to them, well, we have to educate. We have to educate the public about the importance of this. We have to stand up to protect this important food. We have to reinstate the food. We have to protect our sacred areas. We have to remind people that we're still here and it's so important. So I took the kids out, and we started harvesting a lot of invasive plants. And it was a way to teach them. And I went out and we were removing a whole bunch of invasive plants. And I said, you see all these plants? Remember how I was teaching you that we were removing them because they are taking over the land and not providing space for the Kwetlal to grow, not providing space for the Ahnen to grow, they're not providing space for the berry oaks to grow, the arbutus to grow, for the insects that use this community, for the animals that use this community. They're taking that space out and they're being impacted and dying. And they said, okay, well, let's remove it. And so when we're removing these 23 native plants, we're putting it in to create that space for more plants to grow and to be sustained. So when we're removing these invasive plants, I said, well, let's just let's bring this to them. Let's bring them so they can understand the folks that continue to be so disrespectful. Let's create this. And this was in one of the municipalities where I tried my best to go and talk and to ask that they not destroy our burial sites, ask them not to destroy our sacred sites, which one of them was the cave, ask them not to go in and destroy some of the archaeological sites, and to not destroy these important food systems. They didn't have it, and it was very, very difficult. It was very, very difficult to communicate with folks. You could just imagine the words that were said to me, and the whole disrespect and disability. It was just very colonial. It was just awful, and going in and trying to explain it and trying to go through the laws to stop it, and it didn't work. And that's when the protest happened. It continued to evolve. It got more people came in to help, but also more people came in to stop it and to push through this development. And it got it got racist. It got really, really awful. And so when the kids were saying to me as they were seeing this being removed from our ancestral lands, we gathered these invasive species. And I said, I'm going to create this as a bouquet. And I created this bouquet of invasive plants, non-native plants. And I created this bouquet for them. And then just put a sign on it, a balloon that's just over 150 years of colonialism. And then we gathered some medicine plants and just anchored it to a rock and bundled them up. And then just tied a balloon that said the get well soon. And I brought this into the municipal halls where the developers were pretty much threatening. They had a whole bunch of RCMP that came in and shut down the second protest because the first one where the cave was destroyed was removed at the top of the mountain, and we were down below the top of the mountain where there was more of a protest. And they went in and they brought in high level RCMP with rifles, guns, everything, thinking that the protesters should get them out. And this was after the went into that municipal hall, and it was filled with developers, and of course the politicians were there. And I brought in and I put this before the mayor and council as they were continuing the conversation. And that it was an interesting way to, it just silenced the room for a while because it was the reality of it and they asked what it was, and I explained and said, well, this is a gift not just from me, it's also from the youth in my community. That we're really concerned about what was going on here and what was being impacted as far as places that they went for cultural practices, traditional practices, for food, and for sacred sites. And this is, they're really concerned about what was happening. And these invasive species represent that colonialism that's continuing today and the harm that it's continuing to cause today. But we don't want it to end there. We want to be able to put a stop to this, and the get well soon is our medicine so that you will get well soon. We want you to get well soon. We want you to understand the importance of this Indigenous food system to our ancestral lands, to our ancestors, to our future generations, and why we're saying to stop this development, to stop causing this, to continue to cause the harm. And so it's for the next generation, the 7 generations that we need to continue to protect these very important sites. So those are some of the colonial impacts. as it relates to the ongoing harm that continues to happen.
Is it working? One question I have, we're talking a lot about invasive species, which is a really, really key part of ecosystems in Canada. Can you explain what invasive species are?
So invasive species, thank you, Pam. Invasive species are non-Indigenous species. They are not Indigenous. They've been colonized into the landscape, and the invasive ones, they're more aggressive, and they will spread aggressively across the Indigenous land, and in particular Indigenous food systems, and then just clear them out. Of course, there's a lot of other non-native plants that will come in and occupy that land space as well, but there are some that are definitely more aggressive, and Scotch broom is a more aggressive invasive. Himalayan blackberry is a more aggressive one. Ivy is a pretty aggressive one. Gorse as well. There's a lot of other very aggressive invasive species. It's a huge impact, and that's part of in this slide that I'm going to talk a little bit more about and how we can work together. We talk about all of these colonial impacts historically and today, but what can we do about it? You know, beyond doing an acknowledgement of the land that you're on, what can we do together to do this? Like I mentioned, we continue to harvest Kwetlal. We continue to remove invasive species, reinstate Indigenous plants as Holmoch, as Lekwungen. But how do we work together so that people who are not Indigenous to the land understand the importance and contribute in a way that's meaningful? And there's so many different ways you can do this, whether it is through colonial laws that are decolonized, whether it's decolonizing the land, whether it's decolonizing the whole systems within government and institutions and everywhere within what you now know as Canada. It's up to you and what you're willing to commit to do. But I'm bringing this down into how do we work together as it relates to Lekwungen? How do we work together as it relates to Indigenous food systems, in particular Kwetlal Food Systems? So these are some of the photos as some of the things that I've done over the years. I've mentioned some of them. Is definitely going out and working with federal, provincial, and municipal governments, working with park staff, working with educational institutions within my own community, and everywhere within our ancestral lands. As far as sorry, that's moving the slide over. So it's working in so many different ways to educate and to take action on the land and reinstate these Indigenous foods, remove an invasive species, and it's a whole different type of learning experience. So on this particular slide, to the top right, you'll see a photo of Pam and me, very much younger, and me more skinnier. This was like back in 2005. And one of the things that me as Holmoch as Lekwungen, I didn't work with a lot of students. I didn't work with a lot of university students, simply because a lot will come with their agenda. And it's for their specific agenda, not ways to really work together and to find a way that contributes to the work I'm already doing. So I didn't work with very many, but Pam was actually the first student who came to me and said, Cheryl, I want to work on something you're already doing. But in a way that contributes to my honors paper. I want to work with you so it's not burdening you and adding more work, but contributing to your work. And that was when I just said, come on in. And we chatted. Gave her this big picture of where I'm hoping to go with things. She goes, Cheryl, I'm just writing an honors paper. So we narrowed it down and we said, well, let's do a public pick cook. I've done pick cooks, but this one I want to be public so that people can share this experience. I don't want them to know that they can walk away from this feeling entitled to do the pick cook on their own or to do the harvesting on their own, but to experience it so they understand why it's so important to who I am as a Lekwungen, why it's so important to the Lekwungen people and the future generations, to our ancestors, to the Indigenous food systems. And to continue that conversation in a meaningful way. So we did that. We did a pit cook, and it was in 2005. It took a year to really get the bureaucratical end of it all in place. And at that point, I just kind of backed off and left that with Pam to deal with university and with the municipalities. And I just came in and did the other part, the cultural parts of it, doing the harvest, preparing the fields. Pam worked with me in preparing those sites and preparing the pit cook. And then I did the pit cook, and we invited people, thinking maybe 25, 50 people. But I think we had at least 350 people rotating on the ground. So bus loads were coming down from the Chelmsford territory. The Chelmsford elders were coming down and brought fish. There was people coming from all the surrounding nations. So from Tsuut'ina, from Beecher Bay, from Wasanich, all of the surrounding nations on the South Vancouver Island were coming to participate. There was students that were at the university, there was professors, there was staff, there was people from the neighborhood who came to participate. There were schools, like there was elementary schools and high schools coming in by busloads and coming off to experience the pit cook. And I had no idea that it would be at this level of participation and people so willing to learn about Indigenous food sovereignty, about Kwetlal Food Systems, and experiencing it through action. So it was harvesting the Kwetlal, it was doing some invasive species removal, it was having that conversation about what is colonialism and how is it impacting our land, how is it impacting Indigenous people, what is the harm that continues to go on today, and how can we work together? And that was a way of bringing people together around that fire, bringing people around the food, bringing people together while we're talking and eating. And that experience left people with a lot to think about while they digest their food. And I'm sure many just walked away with a whole different view when they look at a Kwetlal food system, when they looked at the landscape at the University of Victoria. And I can just imagine how a lot of people must have felt at that time. And so that's one of the things that I do is those public pit cooks. And I continue to do them at different locations. UVic was kind of hard. There was still a lot of politics there as far as continuing to have this going. So it took quite a while for it to continue, but other institutions like one of the colleges nearby at Camosun was one that I continued to do it annually. This will actually be next week I'm doing one, and hopefully if I'm well, and that will be the 16th one I've done at that college. I continue to do them at elementary schools, in my community, all over our ancestral lands. Other things, of course, is signage. I've been participating in putting artwork into our ancestral lands, not just plaques that have signs on them with welcome to Lekwungen or the traditional name of the place, but it has art in it as well. So I remember back when I was a kid, I was working on this brochure, and it was talking about like some of our ancestral lands so that people can go and visit and just visualize what that used to look like 150 years ago, 200 years ago. And so I went to the city of Victoria, and it was at the time when they were taking down one of the poles in the Victoria Harbour because the water planes were complaining about safety and other people were complaining about it visually. So they dismantled one of our poles. It was a Commonwealth pole with the 3 island nations. So they wanted to put a plaque in place after removing the pole, these welcoming poles, and they just wanted to put like this little bronze plaque on a rock. And I was like, no, this is going to be art. This is going to be art, and it's going to be a lot more wording than that for this particular spot because there's a very important history here that needs to be recognized and told by Lekwungen. So instead of that, I asked for them to get one of our artists in the community to carve some welcoming poles to hold the sign, and the sign with a lot of photos on it with the historical of then and now, and talking about that particular place, Palace, which means place of cradle, and it was where our ancestors brought the cradle that when the baby outgrew it and left it there to bring long life to the child, to the baby. So signage was one of them, and that was, back in the 90s, and then just continuing to do it. This particular sign you see here in the center to the left is one of the signs that I worked on in the Parks Canada, which is known as Fort Rodhill and Fiskard Lighthouse. Several signages in there. In there, I created this proposal with a whole bunch of proposed activities that they need to do to start decolonizing the land and including the Indigenous people on the land, and recognizing the Indigenous history, recognizing our Indigenous roles with these food systems and on the land. And the signage is one of them. The meadow that they have there that they've reinstated I had early conversations with them when that was in the making, and just continuing to be actively involved in that burning meadow. And a lot of that is reinstating. It just removed a lot of grass and put a lot of native plants into the ground and into the meadow. And it grew, and it just continued to expand. And one of the things I'd asked them to do is put up welcoming posts at the entry of that meadow. So at the bottom in the center, those are welcoming posts carved by one of the artists from Wasanich. And they're welcoming posts of man and woman. And of course, at the top is deer and camas, achmin, and what is that in English? Bear stem parsley. And Kwetlal, all along the top of the post. So that's a welcoming post. And of course, there's signage through there. And today I just got another one. We're working on audio boxes on trails.
The post there. Okay. I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just trying to figure out where the signs are here for the posts. Cheryl, do you mind taking a couple questions before we finish off? I have a question, but I want to see if anybody here has a question before we start wrapping up. Is that okay? You ready for a question? Does anybody in the audience have a question for Cheryl? We've been talking a lot about ecosystems in the real sense in this talk, and talking about land that's in Canada and not in front of us. But does anybody have any questions around Indigenous sovereignty, food sovereignty, and ecosystems in Canada? I have a couple questions for Cheryl. One of the things about this conference, it's ecosystems of hope. And of course, as I spoke to you over the last few days, there's a lot of digital people here. It's a digital week in Montreal. And we're looking at ecosystems in all kinds of different ways. And I think I am very happy to have you here because you're bringing very much the land lens back to the conference to a certain degree. There hasn't been a lot of talks specifically about ecosystems in the same way that you're talking about them. But one of the things that strikes me is, over the last 20 years that I've known you, what do you think, with the climate change happening, climate change is affecting BC in a crazy way. We saw the salmon dies off this week. What do you think is still keeping you inspired and bringing you hope with a combination of, the climate change that's happening and affecting BC in an unbelievable way, combined with the work that you're doing with your community and outside of your community that you've talked about so much today? What's keeping you going? What's inspiring you? What is bringing you hope back to the ecosystems that you're working in?
Oh, well, family, of course, my ancestors, the future generation, the land itself, the food, the stories, and the strength and connection is from the land. And just being out on the land and doing this work is so important. When I think of climate change, it's another form of colonialism, and its impacts are from, in a large part, colonialism. But when I think historically to my ancestors, and we have so many stories of Cheryl, so transformer, and if I had time, I would have gotten into. But we have we had several floods, and of course the Great Flood. And when I think of how my ancestors survived that and continued to thrive on that land and adapt to the land and thrive on the land, because the landscapes changed after that flood, they worked that land. And Kwetlal Food Systems, was a part of that, but now it was more abundant based on how they worked that land. And they worked the land as it was and continued to thrive. And of course, the Kwetlal Food Systems wouldn't be here today if my ancestors didn't take care of it. So that gives me strength to know that when I think of climate change as it relates here, in Lekwungen ancestors' land. It's bigger than me. It's bigger than all of us for sure. But when I think of it in that way, I think, well, maybe it will change the landscape. Maybe more Kwetlal Food Systems will come to be. There might not be as many fir forests, but maybe it's going to be more Kwetlal Food Systems because a lot of it is drought resistant. They can sustain a lot of drought. I mean, they still are going to suffer, but they will sustain a lot more drought than the fir forests.
Thank you, Cheryl, so much. I really enjoyed the talk. There was a little bit of parts of it that were harder to hear. The sound quality just went up in the last little while, so thank you very much. Is there any, do you have, like, if anybody wants to have any further questions or something like that, Songhees has a website, right? How can people engage with some of these conversations? Well, how do you recommend, like, we're all the way in Montreal, we're in a big city, the signage for First Nations land acknowledgement it needs improvement over here. And I don't know if you have any sort of last, like, if people are inspired and want to do more work, where would you suggest they go first? It's not obvious over in this city.
Okay, well, it's definitely getting to know the local Indigenous history, getting to know the truth of the Indigenous history, and being committed to being patient, learning that Indigenous truth, be patient with, not obtaining it in the way that you might like at a university. I don't know if patience is the right word, but maybe understanding that it's going to take time to build that relationship. Coming up to an Indigenous person and simply asking them to give you all their knowledge is not going to happen, right? So getting to know people like you would everyone, building that relationship is where it starts. Getting to know one another, learning the truth, learning the history, finding ways to that you want to decolonize land and decolonizing your practices and ways, and in whatever way that you are committed to doing. Is very, very important. As it relates to me, I would say, and also be mindful that when I think of Victoria, and this may be similar there too, there is a huge population in Victoria. And just to kind of give you an idea of what our population is to this huge population in Victoria, we're like between 600 and 700 people. And probably about half that population lives in the community I showed you. The other half live in our ancestral lands or other parts of Canada or elsewhere. So just being mindful that we're not going to be able to get back to everyone as quickly as possible. There is going to be delays. I think where universities can help out is help be that filter and filter some of those to work with nations in different ways in different departments within the community. And kind of filter that. So there are some people that I've asked to be my filter because I can't obviously take every single request that comes to me. And so I do have some people who are filtering it from the university, for example.
Thank you, Cheryl. We're out of time. That's it. So I hope you feel better soon. Thank you for coming in virtually. I hope me and you can continue the conversation at some point in the near future. And anyways, thanks for everybody online being with us and in person. And that's it. That's all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pamela, for moderating that lovely conversation with Cheryl Bryce. I know we had a bit of that sound issue at first, but you were great in trying to extract the pieces from that conversation. Merci beaucoup à Pamela Tudge d'avoir modéré cette conversation avec Cheryl Bryce. Alors, rapidement, juste un grand merci à nos partenaires, collaborateurs principaux de MTL Connect, le gouvernement du Québec et la Ville de Montréal, ainsi que tous les autres partenaires qui ont permis à cette édition d'exister aujourd'hui, incluant les 7 doigts de la main. Alors, nous allons prendre une toute petite pause, quinzaine de minutes, prendre un café, aller à la salle de bain, et nous allons continuer avec un panel très intéressant. Alors, on va se retrouver ici dans environ 15 minutes. À tout de suite.